The screams came first. Short, sharp, piercing the midnight air like glass shattering in the dark. Then came the silence. Not the silence of peace, no, this was the silence of terror. A silence that pressed against the walls of the plantation house, thick and suffocating. And in that silence, she stood, her hands trembling, her eyes wide, her breath ragged. In her grip, a bloodied kitchen blade glistened beneath the lantern light. At her feet lay years, severed. Pale and grotesque trophies lined against the wooden floorboards like discarded shells from some cruel sea. The family, the ones who had mocked her, tormented her, laughed at her inability to speak, were no longer laughing. They clutched their heads, writhing, howling like animals. She didn't hear them. Not the screams, not the cries. She didn't need to, because she had seen everything, every word on their lips, every cruel smirk, every insult, every order. And now they would feel her silence. This is the story of the enslaved deaf servant who turned her pain into vengeance. The girl who lip-read every cruelty, every mockery, every plot against her, and bided her time. Until one night, she struck. But before the blade, before the ears on the floor, before the blood on her hands, there was a girl. A girl born into chains, into silence, into a world that never gave her a voice. This is her story. Before we continue with the video, kindly drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is over there, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. She was born without sound. A world of mouths moving without music, of lips shaping words she couldn't hear. For the others on the plantation, this silence was a curse. For her master's family, it was entertainment. They called her dummy, mute, half alive. They laughed when she tried to mimic words. They mocked her hands when she tried to gesture meaning. But she watched, always watched. Her eyes, sharper than knives, followed every flicker of their mouths. She learned without them knowing, learned their words, learned their lies, learned their secrets. And while they believed she lived in a world of silence, helpless and unaware, she lived in a world of observation. She saw everything. The mornings began with the crack of the overseer's whip in the fields, but inside the house, her mornings began with humiliation. The mistress would stand tall in her silk dressing gown, her lips curling into commands that snapped like whips themselves. Fetch the water. Scrub the floors. Don't dawdle, girl. And when she failed to move fast enough, a slap would follow. The sting across her cheek. The flash of heat. The sharp metallic taste of blood at the corner of her mouth. Her silence made it worse, because when she did not cry out, they struck her harder, desperate for a sound. They wanted her to break, but she would not. Evenings were worse. The family gathered in the parlor, fire crackling, glasses of brandy in hand, and they would turn her into their show, like a court jester summoned for their amusement. "Speak, girl," the young son would say, lips exaggerated, mouthing words too wide, knowing she would fumble. When she tried, the sounds came broken, stilted, wrong. A rough noise from her throat that brought howls of laughter. The mistress clapped her hands with delight. The children pointed and laughed until tears streaked their cheeks. They would mock her attempts to sing, to read scripture aloud. They would force her to repeat words, twisting them into games, then erupt in cruel laughter when she stumbled. They thought her deafness made her stupid. They thought her silence meant ignorance. But she read their lips. Every insult, every whisper, every secret they believed safe in the open air. She saw, she knew, and deep inside, something began to grow. It began the night she was whipped for something she didn't do. A glass had shattered in the dining room. A servant had bumped the table, wine spilling across the mistress's velvet gown. But they blamed her because she couldn't protest, because she couldn't speak her defense. The whip sang across her back, each strike carving fire into her flesh. She clenched her teeth, refusing to scream. The soundless girl enduring soundless pain. And as the whip cracked, she looked up, straight at the mistress's lips as they formed the words. "She's useless. Nothing but broken flesh. We should have cut her tongue out at birth." That night, lying on her thin straw mat, her back torn open, her body trembling, she made a vow. One day, she would silence them. Her silence became her shield. When the family whispered of debts, she saw. When they plotted punishments for other enslaved people, she saw. When the master whispered to his mistress of desires, of cruelties, she saw. The others in the quarters pitied her, sometimes feared her. "She got no voice," they whispered. "Accursed child." She carried her silence like armor. She didn't argue, didn't explain, because silence kept her safe. And yet, every insult, every slap, every mocking laugh etched itself deeper inside her, like cuts you couldn't see, wounds that didn't bleed until they finally did. Years passed. The girl became a woman, stronger, harder. Her silence sharpened into something dangerous. The children she had once served grew older too. Crueler, their games more twisted. They would pull at her hair, shove food into her mouth, laugh as she choked. One night, the son leaned close, his lips forming words she would never forget. "You can't scream. You can't tell. You're nothing." That was the moment. The spark that turned her silence into fury. Because she could tell. She always could. She read his lips. And one day, she would make him understand. Not with words, with silence. By the time whispers of rebellion spread through the quarters, she had already chosen her path. She would not wait for freedom. She would take it in blood. Each night, she watched the family as they slept. Watched their lips still, their mocking mouths finally silent. And she imagined cutting that silence into permanence. She could see it so clearly. The blade, the ears, the silence at last belonging to them. And when the night finally came, when the lanterns burned low, when the air was thick with storm clouds, she picked up the blade, and the house would never be the same again. The storm rolled in heavy that night. Dark clouds pressed down on the plantation house. The air was thick, swollen, and restless. Inside, the family slept. The mistress in her four-poster bed, silk sheets drawn up to her chin. The children in their chambers, sprawled across feather mattresses. The master in his study, slumped in his chair, a half-drunk glass of brandy at his side. And in the kitchen, she waited, hands trembling, blade clenched tight. Her silence was no longer a curse. Tonight, it was her weapon. She moved through the house soundless, her bare feet whispering against the wooden boards. The lantern in her hand flickered, shadows dancing across the walls. Each step was measured, each breath heavy. She had imagined this night for years. Now it was here. The house that had been her prison looked different now. The tall windows, once barred with curtains of velvet, now seemed like open eyes. The portraits of ancestors on the walls, their faces stern and watchful, looked down at her as if they knew what she carried. She moved past the parlor where they had mocked her, where laughter had cut deeper than any whip. She paused there, just for a moment. Her eyes fell to the chair where the mistress had clapped her hands in delight while she struggled to speak. Her grip tightened on the blade. Not much longer now. She began with him. The son, the boy who had grown into a cruel young man. The one who had leaned close, lips twisting into words she would never forget. "You can't scream. You can't tell. You're nothing." His door creaked as she pushed it open. The storm outside masked the sound. Inside, the room smelled of smoke and brandy. His boots lay tossed by the bed. His arm hung loose over the edge of the mattress, fingers twitching in sleep. She stood over him for a long moment, watching his mouth move slightly in a dream. Then she acted. The blade flashed. One swift cut. A wet tear of flesh. His scream erupted, piercing and raw, filling the room. Yet she did not hear it. She only saw his lips, wide, trembling, forming a soundless cry of pain. She caught his ear in her hand, blood dripping warm and slick between her fingers. He thrashed, clutching his head, eyes wild with shock and terror. She stepped back, silent, watching him writhe. And for the first time, she felt it, power. The sister's chamber was across the hall. The girl who had once clapped her hands like her mother, who had laughed until tears streamed down her face as the servant fumbled with broken words. The door opened. The lantern flame trembled. The daughter lay curled beneath her quilt, peaceful lips parted in soft sleep. The servant moved swiftly, almost tenderly. Her hand clamped over the girl's mouth as the blade did its work. The scream was muffled, strangled, lost in the storm. Blood stained the quilt, spreading in blossoms of red. The girl's eyes flew open, filled with terror. Her mouth moved frantically beneath the servant's hand. Please, please. But the servant only stared, silent, her blade dripping. Another ear joined the first. The mistress was next. The woman who had ordered the whippings, who had stood tall in her silks, lips curled into cruelty. Her chamber smelled of lavender and perfume. The stormlight filtered through lace curtains, painting her sleeping face in soft silver. For a moment, the servant simply stood there, watching. Years of torment, humiliation, laughter, all rising inside her chest. The mistress stirred, eyes opening just as the lantern light caught the blade. Her lips parted. She gasped, then screamed. The servant pounced. The knife cut deep, blood spraying across the pillows. The scream became a shriek. The shriek became a wail, yet none of it reached her. She pressed the mistress down, blade slicing again. And then she had it, the ear torn from the head of the woman who had called her useless, broken, cursed. The mistress writhed, clutching at the wound, her mouth forming words of horror, devil, demon. But to the servant, she was only silence. Finally, she went to him, the master of the house, the man whose whispers of lust and cruelty she had read for years, the man who believed she was nothing but a mute shadow in the corners of his home. He was half drunk, slumped in his chair, brandy spilled across his desk. His eyes flickered open as the lantern's glow touched him. At first, confusion, then fear. His lips moved. "What are you?" The blade cut his words short. She sliced fast, brutal. Blood splattered across his papers, dripping into the amber pool of spilled brandy. He bellowed, his mouth a wide cavern of agony. His hands clawed at her, but she was swift, relentless. The ear came away in her hand, warm and slick. The master collapsed, body trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. How could she, his silent, broken servant, do this? But she had. By now, the house was alive with screams. The son writhing in his chamber, the daughter sobbing into her blood-soaked quilt, the mistress shrieking into the storm, the master groaning, clutching at his ruined head. The walls echoed with terror, and she stood among it all, calm, silent, her hands dripping red. The ears, 4 of them, lay in her apron pocket, her trophies, her proof. For years, they had mocked her silence. Now, she had given it back to them. Their screams meant nothing. They were only mouths moving, lips shaping terror she did not hear. She turned, lantern flickering, and walked down the hall. The storm outside howled. Inside, the house was drowned in blood and silence. She fled into the storm. The rain pelted her skin, washing the blood down her arms, onto the dirt path. Thunder cracked, lightning lit the fields. In her apron, the ears knocked together like grisly stones. She clutched them close, as if they were her freedom, her voice, her proof that she had lived, that she had suffered, that she had struck back. She ran toward the quarters, but she did not go inside. She knew what would come next. The dogs, the overseers, the hunt. But for this one night, she was free. Free of their laughter, free of their words, free of their power. The storm carried her into the darkness. By dawn, the house was chaos. Blood smeared across floors and sheets. The master groaning in agony. The mistress clutching at her ruined ear. The children trembling, half delirious with pain. The overseers whispered of demons, of curses. The other enslaved people whispered of justice, of vengeance. And in the shadows of the plantation, her name began to spread. Not as a broken girl, not as a mute fool, but as the one who cut silence into her tormentors. The one who carved her story into their flesh. By morning, the plantation was alive with fury. The overseers gathered with rifles. Hounds were loosened, their snarls sharp against the heavy silence of dawn. The family, bloodied and broken, wailed in their chambers, heads swathed in makeshift bandages. "Find her," the master ordered, voice thick with pain. His words slurred around his wounds, but the meaning was clear. Find her and bring her back alive. Alive, so they could make her pay. The dogs tore through the wet earth, noses to the ground. Overseers on horseback fanned out across the fields, their shouts cracking against the morning air. And in the woods, she ran. Her feet pounded the mud, blood from her apron staining her dress. The storm had passed, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and broken branches. She clutched the ears tight in her hand, her trophies, her proof, her only voice. But the dogs were faster. The hounds picked up her scent, their howls slicing through the trees. She stumbled once, knees crashing into the dirt, palms tearing against roots. But she pushed forward, breath ragged, chest burning, until they were upon her. The dogs lunged, teeth snapping, dragging her to the ground. Their snarls vibrated through her bones. Overseers closed in, rifles aimed, ropes in hand. She did not scream. Even as they dragged her back across the fields, her body bruised and torn, she did not make a sound. The silence enraged them more than any cry would have. They called it a trial, but it was no such thing. In the town square, they tied her to a post. The master sat swathed in bandages, his wife and children beside him, heads wrapped, eyes burning with hatred. The crowd gathered, muttering, pointing. A cursed child, demon-born, mad as the swamp spirits. The judge read charges she could not hear. His lips moved quickly, words tumbling like stones, but she saw enough: murderous intent, mutilation, rebellion. She stood silent, hands bound, blood dried across her dress. When the judge asked for her defense, the crowd laughed. How could she defend herself? She had no voice. But she raised her chin, her eyes fixed on the master's family. She read their lips as they spat curses at her. She saw every insult, every slur, every hateful word, and she smiled. Just once. The crowd gasped. The master's wife recoiled as though she had seen the devil himself. The judge slammed his gavel. Sentence, death. They did not wait. At dusk, the gallows were raised. The rope hung heavy in the orange light of sunset. The crowd pressed close, restless, eager for spectacle. They dragged her forward, her bare feet leaving streaks of dirt across the wooden platform. The ears, her trophies, had been taken from her, displayed before the crowd as proof of her crime. Children pointed at them, wide-eyed. Adults crossed themselves, muttering prayers. The executioner stood ready, face grim. But she did not tremble. She did not weep. Instead, she stared at the family below. The mistress, pale and trembling. The children clutching each other, heads still bandaged. The master, jaw clenched, eyes dark with fury. Their mouths moved, spitting curses. She saw them all. Devil, monster, evil. She lifted her chin higher. The rope tightened around her neck. The crowd hushed. And then the trapdoor fell. Her body dropped, jerked, twisted. The rope snapped, taut. Her silence became eternal. But her eyes, they said, never closed. They fixed on the family until the last breath left her. The plantation was never the same. At night, the family swore they heard her. Not her voice, she had none, but the sound of silence pressing against their walls. The son, feverish from his wound, claimed he saw her in the corner of his room, apron stained, blade dripping, eyes locked on him. The daughter woke screaming, clutching at her head, saying she felt her ear being torn again and again. The mistress refused to sleep without candles burning, muttering prayers through cracked lips. The master drank himself deeper into ruin, haunted by the memory of her smile at the trial. Among the enslaved, her stories spread like wildfire. They whispered of her in the fields, by the river, in the quarters at night. Some said her spirit walked the plantation, head tilted, watching mouths move in the dark. Others said she carried her ears with her still, rattling them in her apron as she drifted through the night. And some swore that if you mocked a deaf child, her spirit would come for you, blade in hand, to cut the sound from your head. She became both a curse and a legend. History buried her name. The records called her a mute slave girl. Nothing more. No name, no past, no voice. But her silence lived on. In the whispers, in fear, in the myth of the deaf servant who cut off her master's family's ears and paid with her life. Her story did not end on the gallows. It lingered. It haunted. Because sometimes silence is louder than screams. And sometimes vengeance echoes long after the voice is gone. Comment below. I want to know which ending feels true to you. And if you're still here, if you felt the weight of her story tonight, don't forget to subscribe. Because these stories, the ones buried in blood and silence, they need to be remembered.